Welcome back. We're now in the third of the three videos concerning Plato. In this video we're going to focus on his value theory briefly and a brief overview of the Republic. And again, I point out the worksheet to you. In the first video we looked at metaphysics in the left-hand column. In the second video we looked at epistemology in the center column. And now we're coming to the third column for value theory. You'll see again that the worksheet parallels the summary sheet, which we'll come to again very briefly in a moment. You've seen where we're going. If you notice, we're now at the bottom of this slide, making our way steadily through to the end of our discussion on Plato. But before we move on, we need to remind ourselves of the big questions that Plato was considering. We saw the big questions on metaphysics, change and non-change, one and many. We saw the epistemological questions, how to know the truth for certain, and how can all people know the same truth. Now we're turning our attention to the highest value. What is the most important thing that has come out of all the work he's done, and all the work we've done? And the answer is justice. His highest value, or the highest, most real thing there is the good, from which everything else flows. Wisdom comes out of good because it's good, and justice comes out of the good because justice is good. And he's then going to look at what that means for the individual, how virtue works out in our lives in terms of justice, and then he's going to try to work out how to explain what a just society would look like. And this will perhaps surprise us. Is this work, The Republic, a thought experiment in which he experiments with the idea of what a just society would look like? Or is he really trying to set up the perfect and just society? Well, these are the big questions he's looking at. And to remind us again of this summary sheet, what's the highest form, moral value or virtue? The answer is justice. There it is right there. And you'll see again the horizontal line is being extended. The good extends to wisdom and wisdom extends to justice. This is the highest level there is. And again you'll see the laws and implications. And then the reality is that Plato is convinced that in the world of human experience, if you don't have access to the form of justice, and you're simply working on what you feel and perceive is just around you, you're going to have imperfect virtue. You're not going to have genuine virtue. And you're going to have imperfect actions. Ignorance is going to cause great harm and errors of judgment. And he's very keen for the issues like justice to be lifted out of the realm of human opinion and lifted into the level of certainty and objectivity. And with that in mind, that brings us to the question, which we've seen before with the pre-Socratics: what is a good life? Because this question of what is a good life, what is virtue, what is justice, in terms of an individual, all wrapped up together. And Plato's answer is an intellectual answer. He says, life lived with the three parts of one's soul existing in harmony is a good life. If your rational part of your soul is ruling and governing your spiritual personality and ruling those unruly appetites of the flesh, if you can keep life in harmony, governed by reason, that's a good life. In other words, it's peace with yourself. A good life is intellectually in turn. It's the way you feel about things, but not just feel, it's the way you are. And so the question is, But what then is morality? Morality is simply personal and social life lived in accordance with virtue. And what is virtue? Doing what the gods approve to be good and virtuous. And that, of course, is meant to be something you can taught and is objective. So it's worthy just pausing for a moment and reflecting back on our discussion on that Plato's dialogue, the Crito, and reminding ourselves of the things we drew out of that discussion. Virtue can be taught. It's objective. It's not something that's your opinion or my opinion. It's something that we can teach, because those of us who are philosopher kings and queens, we know what virtue is, we know what justice is, and we know that the gods approve it, and everyone who knows the form of justice and virtue and the good is going to agree. There's no debate or discussion about it. And so it can be taught. Even the gods are bound by it. I should say the gods approve it. So virtue is what the gods approve of and value. Now, from our perspective, as we move into the application of Plato's moral view as it works out in society, and ultimately in the Republic, we're going to see that the discussion in Crito about obeying the laws of the state no matter what, unless you can convince the state of an alternative position, that view is going to be reflected in the Republic. You obey the laws of the state, and civil disobedience is just unacceptable because it's not virtuous. And with that background, we can move on and begin to see how he really looks at human beings. He sees human beings as, in a sense, morally neutral. They're neither naturally good or naturally bad, but they do need to be taught, because of this business of being born and losing a clear recollection of the forms. You need to be taught virtue, taught the forms. Otherwise, evil will manifest itself through ignorance. And Plato's confident of the value of this instruction in virtue because he is convinced that it's good to be good. And his reason for that is that living virtuously means living with the parts of one's soul in harmony. And he illustrates that with another story taken from Greek mythology. It's called the Ring of Gyges. Glaucon, his brother, in the Republic, asked whether a man could be virtuous and could resist temptation of killing and robbing if he had the Ring of Gyges. Now, what's the Ring of Gyges? The Ring of Gyges is a ring that if you turn the bezel of the ring, you would become invisible. Turn it back again, and you become visible again. And Glaucon is saying all men believe in their hearts that injustice is far more profitable to the individual than justice for all. And Socrates ultimately urges that justice doesn't derive out of personal profiting, because personal profiting doesn't leave you with this harmony of the soul. If you like, to take advantage of people by turning the Ring of Gyges is to place yourself in the position where you have guilt complex. You can never live free of guilt. And so he ends up with an interesting assertion that good people do not need laws to tell them to act responsibly, while bad people will find a way around laws. And there's a sort of ambiguity in his view of man here. On the one hand, it's good to be good. On the other, he can see the struggle that his brother has set before him. Don't we really believe it's best to take advantage and look after ourselves? And Plato's argument is no. It's good to be good. And hence his conclusion, good people do not need laws to tell them to act responsibly. But with that in mind, let's look at his political theory in general. The first thing he says is that the state is a reflection of the nature of humanity. He says, can we possibly refute to admit that there exists in each of us the same generic parts and characteristics as are found in the state? For I presume the state has not received them from any other source. In other words, what human beings are, the state is a reflection of that. It's the soul enlarged. And hence, if the soul is enlarged, if its good life is to be virtuous, to live a life of harmony of the soul, led by reason and spirit under control, then the state should reflect that. Hence, the state to be ruled by philosopher kings and queens, the guardians that implement the decisions of the philosopher kings and queens, and the people who live and be ruled under this condition of reason. And the state will then be in balance and in harmony. The three parts of the state as the three parts of the individual. And in terms of reason and philosophers in the state, Plato in the Republic makes a profound statement. I'm going to read it all, but emphasise one portion, the underlined portion you can see on the screen. The society we have described can never grow into a reality or see the light of day, and there will be no end to the troubles of states, or indeed, my dear Glycon, of humanity itself, till philosophers become rulers of this world, or till those we now call kings and rulers really and truly become philosophers, and political power and philosophy thus come into the same hands. Till philosophers become rulers of this world, or till those we now call kings and rulers really and truly become philosophers. The state truly ruled by reason. Now, with the outworking of that, the operation of society has some interesting implications. A couple of introductory comments first. When you read the Republic, and I hope at some time you will read the Republic, it's one of the great works of Western literature. When you read it, you will be frustrated by the length of it, the effort it will take, but it's worth the effort. The complexity of it is worth labouring through. But at the same time, as you read the unfolding of the Republic, as you make your way, particularly from Book 5 and onward, you begin to sense Plato's love of order, of certainty, and of structure. And hence, that is going to work out in the way he wants society run. There is to be no constitution in the sense in which we would think of a constitution, a document that sets out the principles of justice by which our freedoms are guaranteed. There is no such constitution, no such guarantee of freedom. You see, all the philosopher kings and queens know the form justice. They know what virtue is. And they all agree. There's no disagreement among them. They always agree because they know the form. It's a little bit like saying to a class of students, 2 + 2 = what? And the class in unison goes, 4. Well, in Plato's mind, when all the philosopher kings and queens are asked a question about justice, they'll give the same answer. Here it is. Astonishingly, there is no freedom. It's the job of the philosophers to rule society. And a number have described this view of society as being the very spirit of a dictator. There is no freedom. And further, even though the great philosophers know it's good to be good and assert that through education people just want to do what is good, society must have its guardians. The guardian class is the class of men and women who make up effectively the police force or the army to ensure that the decisions of the philosophers are implemented systematically and thoroughly. And you have the people. And in this society, because education is central, and because education is essential to have a unity and a peace, there has to be an agreed and set curriculum of instruction. Plato wants the stories of Homer and the Iliad, if you like, censored, and the sections of those great stories of the gods misbehaving and running off and doing all sorts of incredible things, which are not good for little ones to hear. They're to be removed, and the nurses who are instructing the children are not to tell those stories. Censorship. There's one curriculum, and it's imposed by the philosopher kings and queens. And that curriculum is going to be the same education for men and for women. And that education is going to include the performing arts and military training. And it's at this point we begin to hear this thesis that there is a sense in which Plato is the very first feminist. Because as this discussion of justice unfolds, and he seriously wants justice for everyone, as he sees it, he is asking a sub-question: what will it take for a woman to be fully engaged in society? What does society have to do to ensure that a woman can truly be a member of the guardian class, can truly be a philosopher queen? But before we pick up that theme, let's remind ourselves the extent of this education. It's not just education in the formal sense of curriculum and physical and military education. Education also takes place with the fine arts and the performing arts. And Plato wanted them censored as well. He didn't want the performing arts to be presenting as heroes the wrong kind of characters. Some of you may be studying art and art history will know that very often in performing arts and literature it's said that good and fine people make very poor main characters of a story. A villain is far more interesting. Well, Plato didn't want any interesting characters of those kinds. That brings us to the noble lie. The noble lie was an argument that Plato said was essential for an ordered and peaceful and just society. The philosopher, kings and queens, were to make an assertion that the gods had determined that every person had a particular job for life and a particular place in society. Now they made that determination in relation to talent and education, but the noble lie had a purpose. It was to establish the elite, who were guardians, and out of the guardians came the philosophers. Plato's society is inherently elitist. It's theoretically based on merit and ability, but it's inherently elitist. And it's worthy of us thinking about that, particularly in relation to our own society today. For example, we in the United States and the Western world are very comfortable saying that we have a fundamentally egalitarian liberal democracy in which anyone can become president of the United States. I think in the light of current events we can realize that while it's a wonderful theory that anyone can become president of the United States, it's slightly terrifying to think that anyone can become president of the United States. It's not surprising when you look at the leadership of our country. If you go to Washington, to the proverbial swamp, and look at the vitae of those in leadership, you'll tend to see a limited number of Ivy League schools appearing. that are deemed to be places where the right kind of leadership is found. And around that comes this noble lie of justification. Plato puts it this way, you see on the slide. While all of you in the city are brothers, we will say in our tale, that's the noble lie, yet God, in fashioning those of you who are fitted to hold rule, mingle gold with their generation. The leaders are manifest by gold, for which reason they are the most precious. But the helpers, silver, that's the guardians, and iron and brass for the farmers and craftsmen. It's an interesting, noble lie. It does raise the question, are we living in a noble lie? Well, it's worthy of some thought. But let's come back to this question of women, and Plato being the first feminist. What does it take for a woman to be fully incorporated into society? Well, she should have the same education, the same physical and military training, but is there something still holding a woman back from fully participating in society? And Plato's conclusion is interesting. And remember, there's a difference between Plato and Socrates here. Socrates was married and had a family and made some interesting comments about his wife. Plato never married. At least we have no evidence that he did. And Plato comes to the conclusion that what's holding a woman back from fully being involved in society is child rearing. And so in his republic, women have children, but have no familial or maternal relations with their children. Their children are passed off to be raised by nurses and professionally trained. And there's a lot of control over marriage and the practice of eugenics to ensure that only healthy specimens survive. There's also an interesting twist. Plato recognizes that there are two reasons why leaders can be so easily corrupted. The first of those is family, and the second of those is property and money. And in his republic, those who are the philosopher kings and queens have no familial relations and can own no property and have no money. It's an interesting structure. There are things about it that frankly give one serious pause, and yet there are profound insights into the needs of what makes us just society. Well, that brings us to the point where we have a brief overview of what do we need to know in this unit. Well, again, I bring you back to the worksheet. All the details that we've discussed in Plato's metaphysics, epistemology, value theory, anthropology, and the Republic, you can fill them in on this sheet. This is what you need to know. This will give you a summary of it. I thank you for your involvement, watching the videos, reading the textbook, and I look forward to you joining me in the next unit of our study together.